Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are back for day number 2 of the 2025 First Stand International Tournament, the first big international tournament to kick off the year. Of course, we covered day number 1 yesterday on this channel. You can check out that video up in the iCard up there as well. Is going to be my primer video for First Stand in general, where we go over the 5 teams and what I expected from them. But obviously, after the first 2 days of action here, we're actually going to have a pretty good idea of where a lot of these teams are going to be sitting, especially because this is such a short tournament. It's really just 1 week long. Like, you don't have a lot of time to get adjusted. If you're not good on the first couple of days, like, that's a problem. You're not going to have a lot of room to breathe, especially for a couple of the teams that end up playing today. So some big matchups to talk about, some interesting kind of just situations that these teams find themselves in. If you're excited, let me know down in the comments section below. What did you expect to happen today, and did it live up to your expectations? You guys know I'm always curious to hear what your thoughts and opinions on all of these games are, but let's go ahead and get right into it. Let's get into the actual analysis. If you're new here, what we are going to do is go game by game in the 2 best of 3s today, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each game that we cover. And of course, at the end of each series, I will be giving a player of the series to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will be looking at the standings. Remember, all you have to do is not be last place in order to make it to the bracket stage, but we're getting closer and closer to figuring out who's going to be there. And honestly, today is a pretty important day in terms of matchups to determine who could potentially be grabbing that number 4 spot and who could be left out in that number 5 spot, depending on one of our matchups. So we'll definitely be touching upon that at the end of the video, but most of today will be spent talking about the 2 matchups we got on day number 2. So without further ado, let's get into the analysis itself. The first series is arguably the more important one of the day, although both are really integral, quite frankly, towards where a lot of these teams are going to land. The first one maybe could be a matchup between 2 teams that are fighting it out for that final spot to make it into the top 4. It's a matchup between the representative from the LEC in Corp and the representative from the LCP in CTBC flying Oyster. This is, of course, CFO's debut at this tournament. They didn't get to play on day number 1. Every team gets 1 day off throughout this tournament. The Flying Oysters just got the first one off, so they have to play every single day from here on out. But Corp probably wishes they had the first day off. Obviously, this was already going to be a bit of a disadvantageous situation for Corp going into this tournament because they had the least amount of prep time of anybody here. They played a lot of domestic games in their season ended the latest into the year. They had to fly all the way over to Korea a lot later than teams like Team Liquid or even Top Esports, whose league also did end pretty late. Like, their journey to Korea is obviously a lot shorter than the European team's journey to Korea. And so Corp has definitely had the least amount of processing time to get used to being in this new country, in this new environment. And I think that really showed up on day number 1. They obviously lost to Team Liquid 2-1 in that series. They did take game number 2, and quite frankly, we did see kind of the glimpses of what this team can be at their best in that game number 2, where Kana and Kalist and even Targamas, to an extent Vladi, were all playing relatively well. They all had relatively good games. The problem for Corp is that their losses, they just looked completely lost, and quite frankly, like, they looked exposed on tape. It wasn't just, Corp was having some bad mechanical days, they were making bad decisions. Like, that was definitely true, and they had a couple of players who played awful in that final game, specifically the middle of the map, but more specifically, it really felt like their tape was getting exploited by Team Liquid. They did a great job of scouting what Corp was, like, doing super consistently, which was aggressively posturing into a lot of these lanes, and they were setting traps for them and being able to take advantage of them in that regard. It's something that you want to see out of a team like Team Liquid, but you don't want to see that out of a team like Corp, and they need to be able to rebound here on day number 2, because again, a loss here might actually be the end of your tournament. This is the easiest matchup you have left if you're not able to pick up a win over CFO. You're going to be sitting at 0-2, and then you have to play the LCK and the LPL teams. That's not a very good look. It's single round robin, and so you don't have another chance to be able to get these easy matchups back. This is a must win for Corp, and it's kind of a must win for CFO as well, and I know that feels strange to say because it's their first series and, anything can really happen, but remember, Corp, after losing to Team Liquid, is probably the only team that has, like, the realistic possibility of being a team that CFO can, like, leapfrog in terms of standings. If CFO can pick this up, they're going to be in a pretty decent spot to get top 4, and all you need to do is not be bottom 1. That being said, they're still underdogs going into this series. Talking a bit about CFO, kind of, I guess, giving a little bit of a TLDR for my primer video on them. They are a team with very defined roles and how they want to play the game. It is very straightforward, depending on their lineup, what their comps are going to look like. Doggo CFO and Kaiwing are going to be the aggressive 2v2 bot lane. They are going to try to play for leads early, and they are going to play through the bottom of the map, especially without lane swaps now. That bot lane is going to be influential, and they're probably going to be the lane with all of the resources. And then Jinjia and Hongqiu are kind of the two that are relied upon to win in the late game. Hongqiu in particular has been a late game team fighting monster domestically. We'll see if that can translate internationally. He is the one player with the least amount of like international experience on this team, and so you really are hoping that it's going to be able to work and translate, but again, clear defined roles. Dago wants to play something aggro that you can play through. Kaiwing wants to be able to enable that in the 2v2, and Junjie and Hongqiu are great team fighters. Now, top lane's a very interesting conversation to have because they really do play two top laners like actually 50-50. I think it's as close to 50-50 as I've ever seen in terms of like an actual top lane rotation. Rest is going to be more of your tank player. Driver is typically going to be more of your aggressive carry player. It doesn't always end up being that way, but what is really nice in this meta in particular is now we have Fearless, right? Like, Fearless with the 6-man roster is way better than a regular 6-man roster would have been like a couple of years ago. I always dogged on teams that had like 6 or 7-man rosters where you swapped players in and out because it just felt like a waste of resources to be practicing with more than one configuration of your team, getting that communication down. But now, especially because Fearless is there, having to I guess very distinct champion pools for each player, like really increases the floor of each team because you can have, you know, Rest come in and pick a lot of his comfort champions, and then you can switch to Driver and all of his comfort champions are still up because Rest didn't pick them. And so that definitely makes it a bit more interesting. I'm still not sold that 6-man rosters are a good idea, but it's definitely worked for CFO. That being said, like the way that they're going to win this series is by playing their own game. They're going to have to get a lead in the bot lane 2v2. I think that that's essential. And quite frankly, Yike and Vladi were awful yesterday. Like Junji and Hongqiu are just going to have to be better than them. If those things happen, I think CFO can win this series, but they are underdogs. K-Corp absolutely should be walking out of this with a win. If they don't, that's a gigantic upset. Like, quite frankly, this should not be close. This should be the bounce back, the get right series that K-Corp is looking for, kind of the one that you were hoping to circle on day number 2, saying like, regardless of what happens on day number 1, we should be able to bounce back with the win on day 2. But if CFO ends up taking it, that is disastrous for K-Corp. So which one of those things is going to happen? Well, the only way to know is to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was CFO. The Flying Oysters are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up 1-0 in this series, and I just talked about disaster potentially striking for K-Corp if they lose this series. Well, the panic button is being hit because, quite frankly, these players have not shown up to Korea just yet. I continue to give them a little bit of an out in terms of like an excuse because they were the last team to arrive in Korea. They are definitely the team that has the least amount of prep time for this tournament overall, but they've played a ton of games domestically, which you would hope would prepare them at least a little bit for this tournament. But at least for now, like this team is just not here. They are not showing up for this. Kana is the only player that looks even remotely playable, and Kana looks incredibly elo stuck in this game and in this entire tournament so far. Kana's looked great. The rest of this team looks like a disaster. And for CFO, this is a ginormous win. And I'm going to be like real honest. I see a lot of takes on Reddit that I just do not agree with. One of the first things that I saw on Reddit for this game number 1 is like horrible draft from K-Corp. Like, how do you walk out of this with a loss? I'm going to shoot this like super straight. There is no way K-Corp loses this game. Like in draft, like this is a draft gap in favor of KC. Like there is no way that they lose this game. These comps both have very similar win conditions when you get later on into the game. Both of them have really, I guess, quite simple front-to-back team fights, which I don't think you expect from this K-Corp comp, but you do have like Vi and Rakan engages to be able to set up for a hyper carry Kai'Sa in the late game. You absolutely can play front-to-back. CFO obviously want to play front-to-back around the Victor and the Rumble and, you know, play with Skarner and Leona and all of those things. You have a ton of engage on their side as well. The difference is not only does K-Corp have a second mode because their dive is ridiculous. Their, you know, Vi, Mbessa, Aurora, Kai'Sa, Rakan dive is unbelievably good, which CFO can't really match, and they're good in team fights, but also you kind of had 3 winning lanes in this game. Like, I don't think it's perfect, but I think Mbessa should be able to have prio over Rumble. I certainly think Kai'Sa and Rakan should have prio over Ezreal and Leona because they just should be able to push in. You know, Aurora into Victor isn't maybe perfect 1v1, but you have the Vi. You have the champion in the jungle that should have all the priority coming out of the jungle. Quite frankly, this should be unlosable for K-Corp as long as they're not the worst of these two teams, and unfortunately for them, they were the worst of these two teams. I like this draft from K-Corp. I don't like this draft from CFO, and yet we're still walking out of here with the CFO win. win, which I think is even worse for them. So we'll go ahead and get into this. Player of the game for me is going to go to Junjia. We're going to talk about this, man. Yike has been like truly horrific. Easily the worst player at first stand. It's not even remotely close. He has been like unplayable at this level, and Junjia once again is able to take advantage of him. Losing to Umti and Junjia on back-to-back days is not ideal for Yike, and again, we'll get more into that, but specifically for Junjia, because a lot of people were really talking down to him after his previous international performances. He has not performed well internationally over the course of his career. It's kind of been a little bit of a running reputation for not only him, but the region that he represents, because he has been one of the best players to come out of APAC, to come out of the PCS the past couple of years, and yet all of his teams tend to disappoint because he doesn't play well internationally. Well, here's your game number one at first stand, where he's just completely outplaying Yike on the Skarner. He's everywhere in the early game. His ultimates are fantastic, constantly landing like 2 or 3 man ults and setting everything up for the rest of his team to be able to take advantage of. Like, honestly, Skarner should not be able to outpressure Vi, especially after the nerfs. Remember, this is post-nerf Skarner. This is not like the super broken, unbelievable B1 Skarner that we've had for the past couple of months. He has been heavily nerfed, and yet Junjia still was able to completely control the pacing of this game, which I think is a disaster for K-Corp. I want to give another big shout out to Doggo and Kaiwing. We talked about it in the primer. Like, this bot lane needs to be good. It's like the way CFO is going to be able to win games, and I was concerned that wasn't going to be the case. Not because I think Doggo and Kaiwing are fake, but because I thought the bot lanes at this tournament were like way too good for them, quite frankly. Like Kaliste and Targamas, Yan and Core, like those are the best parts or parts of the best parts of those teams, and quite frankly, Doggo and Kaiwing were just better here in game number one, and this is not a matchup that, on paper, to me, screams like Ezreal Leona being able to generate way more pressure than Kai'Sa Rakan, especially in a lot of these skirmishes. I think that is entirely on the fact that Doggo was just really good in this game, and Kaiwing was really good on the Leona, super aggressive on the Leona throughout this game. So big credit to the bot lane, big credit to the jungle. I thought Rest played really well on the Rumble, sometimes got a little bit separated from the rest of his team in team fights, but for the most part, the ultimates were fine. The damage was definitely really good. Survived the early onslaught from Kana, you know, a lane that I don't think is necessarily Rumble favored early. You pick this champion for the team fights later, and he really showed up in that. Again, you don't play Rest because he's winning in lane. That's not really been what he's done for CFO. That's been what Driver has done, is win lane. Rest is more of a team fight, like weak side, top lane kind of player, and that's definitely the role he ended up playing here. Hongq is also kind of up in this mid lane matchup. Again, not a matchup that I necessarily look on paper and say like, oh, Victor should dominate this. Like, this is not one of those matchups that I feel like super passionate about in terms of Victor, but at the end of the day, he had a huge CS lead over Vladi. He had way more pressure in a lot of these team fights. Sometimes the ults were a bit early, but for the most part, he looked fine. It was CFO just being better. Again, I don't want to blame this one on draft because I don't think it's draft's fault. I think K-Corp should have won this game if you're going off of draft. I think that there are 2 picks in particular that really stand out to me. 3 if you really want to stretch it, but it was just CFO out-executing, outperforming K-Corp in game number 1, and that is a disaster for KC, who now really has to look at the situation and really start to panic, because again, you are basically 1 loss away from being last place in this tournament, from being the first team eliminated. I'm not going to sit here and say that that's guaranteed to happen. They could pick up a win over Top Esports or Hanwha Life, but you definitely don't want to rely on having to beat one of the top 2 teams at this tournament in order to even get out of the group stage, to not be the first team eliminated. You have to be able to pick up wins here, and quite frankly, K-Corp is just not performing at a level that's even close to good enough. Again, I like this draft. I think the Vi on R2 is a really good pick, even if Yike has looked horrendous on it at this tournament. I think the Kai'Sa is like so good here. I think that there is no excuse for Kaliste not to be the most relevant champion in this game. This is like the perfect Kai'Sa game. You have so much setup on K-Corp. You have Mbessa, you have Vi, you have Rakan, and the enemy team really has no way to stop a Kai'Sa if she gets fed, but Kaliste never really got the opportunity to get online. Vladi continues to just not play well at this tournament. Quite frankly, the 2 worst games I've ever seen him play have been at first stand. It was game 3 against Team Liquid and game 1 here against CFO, where it's just like, dude, you are doing absolutely nothing. You're doing no damage. The ults are kind of lazy. You're not really getting behind anybody. You're losing in a lane matchup that I think is fine for you. It's just not a good look. Yike and Vladi have not shown up, but Yike is the problem. He's going to get dead of the game. This guy cannot play Vi at this tournament. Again, I don't know what team saw on tape, but clearly there is something where it's like, we know Yike is going to queue over the wall at this exact spot, and we are just going to sit there and wait for him because he's going to kill himself. And he's done it over and over and over again. And again, the reason I say that it's a tape problem and not like, oh, you know, Yike was, you know, just making a worse mistake at first stand. Like, this is clearly something he was doing in the LEC, because now both Team Liquid and CFO have stood in basically the exact same spots and gotten the same results from being able to pick off Yike. Clearly he's been doing this all year, and they've just been able able to spot this, and they're now taking advantage of it. He needs to be able to clean this up because it's just not good enough. Targamas, I thought, was pretty lazy on the recon in terms of looking for engage angles. There were often times where I was like, you can go, like, you can get a pick here, you can play more aggressive, and he just wasn't really looking for it. Kana's awesome. Like, he's a really good player, and he's trying his best, but he looks a bit elo held on this team right now. Mid jungle looks like a disaster, like the worst at the tournament by far. Khalees should have been, you know, better than he was this game. Targamas should have been better than he was this game, but at the end of the day, K-Corp are walking out because they just got outperformed. Kana can't do everything on his own on this Ambessa, and now, like I said, you're basically one game away from being in the worst possible position, being 0-2 in a tournament where now all you have left to do is face the teams that are supposed to beat you even harder than the teams you've already lost to. You have to be able to pick up this win in game number 2, but if CFO can sweep K-Corp, that's ginormous for them. Remember, it's like the same on the reverse side of this. It's bad for K-Corp. It's great for CFO if they can pick up a win here, because that all but guarantees them a top 4 spot. Not guarantees, of course. Tiebreakers can come into effect and things can happen, but really, like, if K-Corp go 0-4 and CTBC picks up a win here, like, that's top 4, and that's all you're looking for from this roster. So a big game number 2. Who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was CFO. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to take this series 2-0, and they will knock K-Corp down to 0-2. They themselves will go to 1-0 at the start of this tournament, picking up a win in their first series. This is gigantic for CFO. This is disastrous for K-Corp. Not only is it a loss for KC, but it's a 0-2 loss, which puts them in a really, really bad spot. They're not mathematically eliminated or anything like that, but they're about as close as it gets, especially considering the path that they've had so far. They've played the 2 easiest teams that they're going to face in this tournament. They've lost to both. They've only picked up 1 game win at the tournament so far. It's not looking good for them, but it is looking so good for CFO. We kind of really discounted this team, talked about how they were pretty clearly the worst team at this tournament, that they were, you know, gonna be coming in at number 5 in everybody's rankings, that nobody expected them to be able to make the bracket stage. Well, with this 2-0 win, they haven't guaranteed it or anything, but they're looking pretty darn good to be able to get to the bracket stage, and it's only 1 series in, and it's not just, oh, they're in a good position in the standings. They looked really good in this series as a team. They could be the 3rd best team at this tournament. I'm certainly not counting that out at the current moment. We can go ahead and go over it, but there is a lot to talk about. Once again, I don't think the draft gap is really all that big between these two teams. I think there are win conditions for both. I think last game K-Corp had the better draft, and I felt pretty good about saying that. This game, I think CFO maybe slightly has a better draft, has a bit more consistency in terms of where they're going to get their leads, or at least shut down the leads of K-Corp, but I think K-Corp has a lot of options in the later half of this game as long as they stay relatively neutral. Obviously, they don't do that, but I think you're looking at a much more balanced draft between these two teams. I wouldn't necessarily give a gigantic lead to one or the other. K-Corp has so much poke on their side with Jace, Brandon, Varus. That's clearly what you want to draft around, but you also have a winning lane with Yone into Talia, which I do think is a Yone-favored lane. Again, as a mid lane player, like, that to me screams a matchup that Yone should have prio and pressure in, especially with the brand. Maybe you're not going to have as much prio with the Varus or with the Jace because he's playing into Sion in this case, but, you know, the middle of the map should be positive. Unfortunately for K-Corp, the middle of their map has been horrendous at this tournament, and that absolutely continued here, and so the one lane that I think actually did have some pressure early in the game wasn't able to get all that much pressure. You had this global coming out from Talia that ended up being way more valuable, and then you're looking at top and bot, who both are going to have pressure in these matchups, and it's not really winnable at that point. You're not able to get to the part of the game where you're just able to do a billion damage from 800 miles away. That being said, you also have CFO's comp being super easy to execute in the back half of the game. My concern when they drafted this was just, do you have enough damage to play the front to back that you're clearly setting up for? Like, Misfortune's gonna have to be a huge part of this team's damage, and luckily for CFO, Doggo ended up showing up. He's gonna get player of the game for me in game number 2. Talked about this yesterday on the channel, but Reddit has some sort of hate boner for Misfortune as a champion. It's the same as their hate boner for Jhin. Like, I kind of went into depth on this yesterday, but it's very clear that Reddit just doesn't like any AD carry that isn't gonna top the damage charts every single game, or has the potential to top the damage charts every single game. Like, they give Ezreal and Varus a pass because they can do a lot of different things, but like Jhin, Misfortune, these champions that are much more all-arounders, like, they just hate them and they always dog on them when they lose. But like, there is a ton of value to these champions in pro play. I've been defending them for a very long time, and this is like the dream Misfortune game. Again, what you want as MF is a champion that maybe doesn't dominate lane in the same way that something like Kalista does, and it's, Kalista's like permabanned for a reason. She's better at that than something like Misfortune, but is certainly still very strong in the early game, and then has a teamfight ultimate that's just going to be good basically no matter what. You don't need to top the damage charts on Misfortune. You're just going to be useful throughout the entire game. You can shut down good early lanes on the other side if you want to play against, something like Kalista or something like Draven or something like Varus that typically can generate pressure early, or you can play against like hyper carries and just kind of beat them early and still be useful late. The positive of MF is just how much of a well-rounded champion she is, and Doggo, I think, really showcased that. If you do give Misfortune gold, she can still do an absolute boatload of damage if you position well with her in fights, and that's what Doggo did here. He's been awesome so far at this tournament. I know it's only 2 games, but he was just straight up better than Kaliste in matchups that, well, I would say in game 2, he's in a good matchup, but in game 1, he was not in a particularly good matchup. The Ezreal should not have been as effective as the Kai'Sa, and yet he still was just better than Kaliste, and that is a really encouraging sign. I think Kaiwing also played really well in this game on the Rel. Hongq was awesome on the Taliyah, but overall, player of the series is once again going to go to the jungler opposite of Yike. This time it's going to be Junjia in the jungle for CFO. I gave this to yesterday for TL. I'm giving it to Junjia for CFO. The jungle gap in this series was just absolutely ginormous. Once again, how much of that is Yike and how much of that are his opponents? Like, that's up for you to determine, but this was another really good Sejuani game. He was just looking so aggro. He was playing the Sejuani like it was Vi. It was actually really, really fun to watch. Really aggressive stuff coming in from him, and honestly, I was just incredibly impressed with his gameplay. Again, we talked about it kind of at the beginning, but people were kind of doubting and putting some negative thoughts out there about Junjia because he hadn't played well at international tournaments, but this was a really, really good start. He really stepped up for his team today. Driver ends up coming in on the top side. I want to remind you guys, it truly is a 50-50 on the top side in terms of who gets playing time here for CFO. Driver often comes in at the end of a lot of these series. He picks up the Scion, and not typically a champion I would associate with his playstyle because he is definitely more of the sword of this sword and shield dynamic, but the Scion was awesome. It certainly did its job, which was try to neutralize the Jace, who was the only win condition for K-Corp throughout a lot of this game, but overall, CFO were just better across the board. Like, there's honestly nothing else to say. Huge execution diff in this series. All 5 roles were better than K-Corp on the other side of this map. I guess maybe with the exception of top lane, but even then, like, it's not like Driver or Rest played poorly. It's just that Kana was actually the only player trying for K-Corp. All 4 of the other roles, for sure, were better. Hongq with a gigantic mid gap over Vladi in this series. Junjia, obviously, a gigantic jungle gap over Yike. Doggo and Kaiwing were definitely the better bot lane in this series. It's just not a good look for K-Corp, and quite frankly, they are in like worst case scenario. You couldn't possibly draw this up worse. Like, if they got O2'd by TL, that would be actually worst case scenario. There's obviously no way to get worse than that, but this is about as realistically close as you can get to it being like full-blown panic mode. The most common and most likely outcome for this team at this point is 0-4. Like, anything other than 0-4 would be a surprise, not only because of their form, but because now they have to go into the teams that they were supposed to lose to the entire time. Even at their best, they were supposed to lose to these other teams, and they're not in form. And so I don't think things are going to get better for KC. The middle of this map is a disaster. Yike is going to get yet another dud of the game. I think someone looked, I think he's like 4-28 in losing games or something like that at this tournament. Something ridiculous where it's just like unplayable, like actually unplayable for Yike. He's had the worst tournament I've ever seen. Not only him have, but really any major region jungler have. I can't remember a tournament where one player just looked so atrocious and abysmal as like a champion coming out of one of the big major regions. I can't remember a time where it's ever been this bad. This is gotta be up there for one of the worst international tournaments ever. Vladi is super lucky about that, by the way, because if Yike wasn't taking all of the spotlight for being as bad as he was, people would notice that Vladi has been arguably just as bad in the mid lane. I mean, this dude is getting gapped every single game, and it's not like he has losing matchups. Again, Yone should do fine into Taliyah. This is the one matchup on K-Corp's side that I think, from a lane priority perspective, could be in favor of KC, but Vladi just can't play right now at this level. He's had the 2 worst games, maybe the 3 worst games I've ever seen him play. I certainly think Game 3 against Team Liquid and Game 2 here against CFO are the 2 worst games I've ever watched from Vladi, but Game 1 here against CFO wasn't much better. I already talked about it as one of the worst games I've ever seen him play. Like, it's ridiculous just how bad the middle of the map was. Truly one of the worst jungle mid performances I've ever seen at an international tournament. And to come from a champion from the LEC, it's absolutely unbelievable. Like, I never expected this. Kaliste and Targamas, I'm not going to blame them entirely. Targamas missed every single hook this game on Nautilus. Like, if you wanted to give him dud of the game, give it to him. Like, dude couldn't hit anything with a Nautilus Q. It's actually ridiculous how bad that was. I'm not blaming Kaliste as much, but we're not going to try and pretend he was better than Doggo or he was even keeping up with Doggo in this series, because that absolutely wasn't the case. Again, again, he had a ton of opportunities in game 1 to take over, and he just didn't. It's not like Kaliste was playing phenomenal. I think he played better yesterday against Team Liquid than he did today. Kana was the only one even attempting to try and do anything, but he's playing Jace into Sion. It's literally unplayable. He cannot get a lead in that matchup, and he certainly can't 1v9 on Jace into Sejuani Rel. Like, what is he supposed to do this game? It's actually unfair for Kana, who's elo held on the top side. But overall, K-Corp looked like a disaster. I truly mean it. Like, I'm not trying to be hyperbolic when I talk about this. This might be the worst #1 seed performance I've ever seen at an international tournament. I see a lot of comparisons to Mad Lions. Mad Lions were okay at MSI in 2022, and they made the quarterfinals at Worlds in 2022. That team at least has some track record of doing okay at their first international tournament. Like, things got worse, obviously, in 2023 and 2024. It wasn't, like, ideal in that regard, but at least they started off strong. Like, for this to be K-Corp's first ever international tournament, and for it to be maybe the worst showing that the LEC has ever had at an international tournament is just horrible. Now, all of this could go away if they somehow, some way win tomorrow or the day after, or, beat Top Esports or Hanwha Life or some sort of miracle upset. But if they go 0-4, and especially if they lose all 4 of the next 4 games that they end up playing, like, we're genuinely going to be talking about this as one of the worst LEC international performances ever. And then for CFO, this is a gigantic victory. This team is in a really good spot to be able to make top 4, to be able to make the best of 5 stage, and I just don't think anybody expected that of them. Maybe they're even better than what we're giving credit for. That matchup against Team Liquid has suddenly gotten a lot more interesting with this 2-0. I'm really excited to see more of Doggo and Kaiwing. Junjie looks like he's in form. This could actually be one of the more interesting teams at the tournament, and I'm really happy to be able to say that. But now let's go ahead and move on to our second series of day number 2, and this one was just as interesting for me on paper considering how day number 1 went. It's the representative from the LTA Team Liquid taking on the representative from the LPL in Top Esports. I'm very intrigued to see the direction that both of these teams go, and of course Team Liquid picking up a very big victory over K-Corp on day number 1. 2-1, they looked pretty good, all things considered, in that series. Jan looks like an absolute monster, as we expected. Him and Core JJ are one of the better bot lanes at this tournament. Again, we've talked about how good the AD carry and support roles, the bot lanes in general, are at first stand this year. I think that's really encapsulated by just how good Jan and Core are individually as players. I think there's been a lot of talk about Jan and Jackie Love, Jan being like a Jackie Love type of player and, being compared to him, at least domestically in North America. It's really cool to see that he's going to get the chance to be able to go and prove that here internationally, taking on Jackie Love in this matchup. But Core JJ has been just as big of a part of this. I've talked about it a lot this year, but I think Core has started off 2025 even better than he played in 2024. He was good in 2024, but I thought he was a bit overhyped. I thought Jan was doing a lot more than he was getting credit for. Now it really does feel like Jan is a superstar. I've called him the best player in the West, and that's been a take that has really aged well, and Core, I think, is, facilitating that even more than he was last year. It's really been an awesome 2v2, and even adding on top of that, like, the middle of the map was just awesome. Now, K-Corp's middle of the map looks like a disaster even against CFO, and so can Umti and APA carry that success over to a team like Top Esports? That's certainly going to be something to track, and of course, Impact was not great in that series against Kana, against K-Corp. He really was the one, I don't want to say, like, player on the team that was losing, because that's not necessarily fair to Impact, but he was definitely taking a weak side approach, and he's not really been all that great so far in 2025, and so that is a bit concerning. Umti, I'm very concerned about his matchup into Kanavi, even with Kanavi coming off of a pretty poor series himself against HLE. There are just way more question marks about Team Liquid, but Top Esports did not look great on day number 1. If Team Liquid can come out and even pick up, like, a game victory in this series, I think that's going to be super encouraging, and especially if Jan can prove that he can go toe-to-toe with LPL caliber, like, players just in general, that he can show up and kind of compete on that level. That's the kind of thing you need to see to really believe that Team Liquid is the type of team that can make an impact at the international level. But for Top Esports, this is obviously supposed to be your rebound game in the same way that CFO was supposed to be K-Corp's rebound game. You should be able to walk into the series and just be the better team in this one. Kanavi obviously really struggled against HLE. Peanut basically completely manhandled him in that jungle matchup. Cream was definitely worse than Zeka on the other side. 369 really struggled to play into Zeus. Like, this is supposed to be the rebound, like, right the ship kind of game, and honestly, I think Team Liquid is, a pretty good candidate to give them a lot of that momentum back, not only because I think Team Liquid is just kind of worse in a lot of areas. Obviously, I think there's a big difference between the LCK and the LPL and, like, every other region in the world, but even more so on top of that, this is a pretty miserable matchup for Team Liquid. When you look at the ways that they end up losing, oftentimes it's through the top of the map. Like, Jan and Core being awesome, I think, like, is great, and I think they can compete against the better bot lanes in the world, but, like, Impact is not the player that I think he was last year so far this year. I think he's the kind of player that 369 can take advantage of. Certainly has his own problems, and APA is like notoriously not a great laner going into a player who's known for his mechanics in Cream. Like, I just don't think this is a great matchup on paper for Team Liquid, and that could be exactly what Top Esports needs in order to get back into the win column. But they need to be able to show that not only can the top side of the map like continue to dominate, but the middle of the map can keep that form that they had domestically that got them a championship in the first place. I'm less concerned about Jackie Love and Crisp. Now, obviously, Yon versus Jackie Love is like the big highlight matchup of this series, and I think the one that you're really looking at because it's maybe the best Western player versus the player he's compared to the most at the high-end level in Jackie Love, but I honestly don't think bot lane is going to determine how this series goes. I think if Kanavi, Cream, and 369 end up showing up on the top side of the map, that's likely just going to be GG's for Team Liquid. I don't think they have the firepower to be able to keep up, but if Liquid can play their style, if they can get APA out of lane onto a lot of these skirmishers, get him out, contesting a lot of these objectives, if Team can have some good early games, and if Impact can just survive on the top side, like, that's the strategy for Team Liquid to be able to win. Allow Yon to carry games. That's why I was so frustrated when they put him on Ashe duty yesterday, because as good as I think Ashe is as a champion, I think Team Liquid at this tournament really needs Yon to pop off in order for this team to succeed. So, gonna be interesting. Obviously, Top Esports are big favorites going into this, but they are 0-1 for a reason, and Team Liquid is 1-0 for a reason. We'll see if they can even it up, or if, either of these teams can, Team Liquid in particular can pull off that big upset and go 2-0. The only way to know is to go game by game, so let's kick it off with game number 1. The winner of game number 1 was Top Esports. They are going to take game number 1 of this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and just like we anticipated, quite frankly, they are just better in certain areas of the map. We really called this out in the preview here, where it's not that, like, oh, I'm concerned that Top Esports isn't going to be able to keep their form up. It's more so, like, Team Liquid just don't really have the manpower, and they certainly don't have the matchups to be able to kind of force the issue in the way that Hanwha Life did on the previous day. This looks like it's going to be a bounce-back series from the top of the map, and that's really what we were looking for Top Esports. To Liquid's credit, I think the draft is really smart. I think it gives them a lot of opportunities and options. You have ways to be able to play for double marksman in the late game with things like Galio and Rakan to be able to not only protect but enable that double marksman comp if you end up going late enough, and theoretically you should have a lot of priority in the early game. I think flexing the Galio up top lane is a really smart draft move here, getting Tristana into that Aurora matchup, and specifically getting Tristana to be able to shut down a lot of the pressure that Vi should theoretically be putting on the early game is pretty massive from a draft perspective, and I like Ezreal Rakan as a very safe bot lane. Not sure it works towards Team Liquid's strengths. You're relying so much on APA to be the primary option here for Team Liquid. I just don't think Ezreal is ever going to have enough damage to be able to, like, fully win team fights in the back half of this game, but theoretically, Team Liquid should control the pacing of this, especially if is active, and he was in this game. I'm certainly not mad at I think he played fine, but overall, the solo laners just ended up getting really gapped in this one. Jungle was a bit of a problem, not because was bad, but rather because Kanavi was really excellent, and that was enough to get Top Esports across the finish line. Add that on to the fact that their team fighting in the back half of the game is just way easier to execute than Team Liquid's. Even if Liquid has an out in that stage of the game, I think theoretically Top Esports just scale a little bit better, and their front to back is definitely cleaner. I think that was really kind of the nail in the coffin, quite frankly, for Team Liquid in this one. So even if I do like the draft for TL's side, I think TES obviously just kind of proving that they can execute on theirs a little bit better. Player of the game for me pretty much has to go to Kanavi. I mean, what a bounce back game. He really needed it. It was properly pointed out in the comments of my videos yesterday that he was truly atrocious. I may have not even given it enough credence in the video, just how poorly he played against Hanwha Life, and he's going to need to be better. But again, this is kind of his get right series, right? This is his matchup against and, going against APA and Impact players who are kind of prone to being a bit more exposed by ganks and early pressure coming in from junglers, and Kanavi definitely punished that in this one on the Vi. Coming off of a couple of Yike Vi games, it's very nice to see Kanavi just be able to take over the game on this champion, be able to show that the aggressive tendencies that Vi can have in the mid game are basically unmatched if the champion has any semblance of priority on the map, and he really was excellent. He wasn't the only player on Top Esports to play well, but he certainly was the one that caught my attention the most. I think 369 is the other player I'm really looking at as just like having a phenomenal game in general. Top was a ginormous gap in favor of 369. I get that Rumble is super OP, and honestly, I'm really starting to buy into the fact that Rumble is just like way too strong in terms of numbers, because I keep talking about how, oh, he goes into Jace and he should lose to Jace, or he goes into Galio and he should lose to Galio, but none of these things ever end up actually mattering. Rumble just ends up being super useful in lane anyways and dominating team fights. It just feels like the champion does a little bit too much right now, but 369's like a notoriously not good Rumble player, so Impact picking a matchup that should be a counter matchup, a really nice flex onto the top side, and then getting absolutely stomped. Like, we'll talk about Impact. He's just not having a good 2025. There's really no other way to say it. And 369, again, kind of a confidence booster to get it back. It's the JDG boys. It's the homeboys, if you will. I kind of like calling them the homeboys. That feels like a fun little title for them with their new coach, obviously, here on TES, their old coach on JD Gaming as well. I think the homeboys getting back into shape here, getting back into form is just super important for Top Esports. They were a big reason why this team was at the tournament to begin with. Obviously, mid lane was a pretty big gap in favor of Cream as well. Like, APA just had a really horrible game. I don't think Cream really played all that well. He had a gigantic lead in the early game and did basically nothing with it as the game continued to go along. But at the end of the day, he was better than APA, and that's all he needed to do. The Tristana was kind of the main character of this Team Liquid draft, and it didn't end up working out. You have Jackie Love on Ashe and Crisp on Braum to be able to facilitate and kind of push that forward. Jan was really good this game. I think Core was also pretty solid this game, but mostly that was because Jackie Love and Crisp didn't really have a lot of priority. They weren't supposed to have priority. That's not what this draft was about. This draft was about getting Kanavi out on the map, getting 369 and Cream to be able to dominate their solo lanes, and again, that's exactly what happened. A pretty big masterclass coming in from the top side of TES. And then for Team Liquid on the other side, their solo laners just got absolutely obliterated. They got torched in this game. I mean, gigantic gaps in every front. Whether you want to give dud of the game to Impact or APA, it's really up to you. Both of them were awful in game number one here. I'm giving it to Impact because this should be an even freer matchup than APA has in the mid lane. Even if I still really like Tristana and I still think she is a great pick here, like Impact flexing that Galio up to the top lane, like he's just supposed to survive. That's his whole role, and he can't even do that right now. He has honestly just not been very good in 2025. People are going to overlook it because it's Impact and he gets no resources on the top side, but like he's actively going down like 30-40 CS every game. Even domestically in the LCS, he was not very good on the top side of the map, and I hate to keep pushing this narrative forward, but man, there is a huge difference between year one Impact on a new team and year two Impact on a new team. He always gets worse in that year two. This is the year two back on Team Liquid, and he's gotten worse. It's been so regular for him over the course of his career, and it just continues. This was an awful Galio game, but I don't want to downplay just how bad APA was on Tristana. I don't even think Cream was playing all that exceptionally well, and still he mega gapped APA in lane. He got super far behind, and once the Tristana ended up losing in the early game, once there was no pressure to be able to play around Trist, not only in the mid game, but in the late game as well, like this game is doomed. Like there's actually no way that you ever end up winning this. Humpty tried a lot of things. His scoreline looks bad, but his gameplay was definitely better than his scoreline would indicate. He's still playing this tournament fine, and Jan and Core were good this game. I'm not even willing to say, like, fine. They were actively good. Jan actually actively had a good game. I think Core actively had a good game. It just didn't really end up mattering. The solo laners were an albatross that Team Liquid just could not shake in this one, and obviously they need to fix that. If they're going to get absolutely gapped in that department, like, it's unwinnable. We talked about how the top side of the map needed to survive, specifically the middle of the map, needed to survive for Team Liquid, and right now it's just not happening. But nice win for TES. Are they going to be able to carry it over and sweep Team Liquid 2-0 and, you know, get to 1-1, or is Team Liquid going to be able to pull out a win here? Remember, they're really just looking for a game win. I think if they get a single game win against Top Esports, that's probably considered to be a success. Anything else would probably be a disappointment for Top Esports, anything other than a 2-0 sweep. So are they going to be able to pick up that second win here, or is Team Liquid going to maybe shock the world and pick up a game 2 win? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Top Esports. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to take this series 2-0, and this was not even really a challenge for them. This was the get-right game that they were expecting. This was definitely one of those series that they went into just being like, we are way better than you, and we're going to draft like it. We're going to take away a lot of your big picks. We're going to ban the Ziggs. We're going to ban the Talia, and we're going to R1 Nico here in game number 2 and force you to do something else now that obviously the Tristana is taken off the board. APA tries to move into his Hui. It really does not work out, but it's not just the middle of the map that ends up collapsing here in game 2. It's everywhere. This was even more dominant than game number 1. This was the best game that Top Esports has played at this tournament up until this point, and you got to give them a lot of credit for that. For Team Liquid on the other side, it's obviously a bit disappointing to fall in such convincing fashion to a team like TES here, but at the end of the day, it's Top Esports. Like, you were expected to lose this. You weren't really expected to even, like, compete against them. You maybe hope to see a better performance out of the bot lane because, generally speaking, Jan and Core were pretty awful here in game 2. But again, at the end of the day, like, losing to Top Esports is not a surprise. It's not a shock. You accounted for that. I think Spawn even came out, or the Twitter account or something came out and said, like, our goal was to win one game and hopefully, like, you know, take their mental away. And that just didn't end up happening here, but we knew that Top Esports was better, and that was the result. So we can go ahead and talk about it. The draft is pretty simple to go over. I honestly think that it's, pretty Team Liquid favored, at least if the teams were relatively even. I think TL has a better, front to back in the later half of the game. Even if they don't really want to play it, they definitely have better ways to play the map. I think Hwei is going to be really strong the later this game goes. Maokai, Nautilus, Cassante, you have so many tools to be able to disrupt what Top Esports want to do, and quite frankly, Top Esports does not have a late game. There really is no way for them to be able to play out the later part of this game if they're not constantly getting picks, if they're not constantly trying to skirmish in the mid game. Unfortunately for Team Liquid, Top Esports was able to get a ton of kills early on, and that just kind of makes the game very impossible to win, off of Pantheon, off of the Nico support, all of those things that were really problematic. But from a draft perspective, I really don't dislike what Team Liquid ended up getting. I think the B1 Kalista is fine. I think it's a really good process to pick that champion when it's available. It just, you didn't have the bot lane to be able to make it work in this game, and that really is the end of the story. Player of the game and player of the series, to me, is very obviously going to go to Kanavi in the jungle. Jungle's been a very important position at this tournament so far. We've really seen that whichever jungler ends up, performing the best, I think is definitely the one that ends up winning the series, and obviously that's, pretty standard, pretty straightforward, but I think 3 of the 4 series so far, I've given player of the series to jungle. It's just been one of those positions where whoever ends up generating more pressure is kind of able to dominate on the current patch. Kanavi ends up bouncing back really well. Again, we've talked at length about how he struggled against HLE. He needed this series in order to feel like a star again, and didn't exactly put up a ridiculous amount of resistance, nor did the rest of Team Liquid. The Pantheon itself was excellent. Again, this is really a pick comp at the end of the day. There really aren't a lot of other ways for this team to be able to win if they're not constantly generating kills across the map, and Kanavi was so active at getting those kills. It's an 11 kill Pantheon game coming out of the jungle. You can obviously see that they were successful in that regard. So you do give them credit there. I think the player that I really want to shout out that I think had a really great series that I'm not sure enough people are going to talk about is Crisp in the support position. This Nico game was awesome here in game 2, and he was really good in game number 1. I maybe didn't give the Braum enough credit for his movements throughout a lot of that game, but the Nico was a playmaker, and honestly, Crisp has been pretty good across this tournament. Even when you look at their loss to HLE, Crisp wasn't really making any sort of bad plays. Him and Jackie Love were definitely the best part of Top Esports in that series, and he was once again a really big asset here. Crisp, when he is on, is awesome. His mind for the game and where he needs to be is really good. He can sometimes just get a little bit too funky in terms of the ways that he wants to go about things, and obviously that leads to some situations where he is disconnected from the rest of his team. But Kanavi and Crisp were definitely the 2 players that stood out to me in this series. 369 was excellent here. He got dove on repeat, outplayed a couple of those dives on the Aatrox, on the R5 Aatrox, and ended up looking really good on that champ. Had a better game number 1 than game number 2, but that's because he was basically, force camped in game number 2, and he still was super useful on the Aatrox. Cream goes deathless against APA and is by far the better mid laner. Jackie Love, probably the player that did the least amount on Top Esports, but still was good. He didn't exactly make mistakes, and trust me, he was definitely better than Jan across this game number 2 in particular, so big ups to Top Esports. This is the exact kind of game that you wanted to see out of them to get them back on track. And for Team Liquid, what do you want me to say? This team just didn't have the talent to be able to compete with Top Esports. It really does come down to that. Obviously, the disappointing part is Jan and Core just kind of having a bad game. Jan in particular just not being very good on the Kalista is definitely a bit disappointing because he has been so good in lane, and you give him the best laning champion in the game, and he still loses this matchup. This is his worst game at the tournament up until this point. Just not really a great look for Jan. Hopefully, he can kind of turn that around. It is just one game at the end of the day, but he was not better than Jackie Love and Crisp. He was not really on the level of Jackie Love and Crisp in this game, but dud of the game for me is going to go to APA in the mid lane. At the end of the day, the jungle mid gap in this series is really what kind of was the biggest detriment to Team Liquid. APA had no pressure at all in the mid lane, and how do you play this game without any mid pressure? Again, it's pick city for Top Esports. Anytime they run into anybody on the enemy team, they can basically kill them instantly, and APA was the victim of that in a lot of specific cases. He just wasn't safe enough. He certainly didn't have the laning prowess to be able to go up against somebody who's so mechanically talented in Cream, even if Cream wasn't as aggressive as I would have wanted him to be in this series. Kanavi ended up really punishing APA in a lot of circumstances. It just wasn't a very good series for him. Definitely had a worse game 2 than a game 1. The Maokai just really didn't end up working. Even if I like Maokai here, he ends up getting counterpicked by the Sylas on R3 because the Nico ends up being their support pick on R1 instead of the mid lane pick like I assumed Team Liquid ended up assuming. Impact wasn't awful in this game, at least in comparison to what he's been recently, but that's because he received a ton of resources on this Cassante. This is his best champion, and he still got a ton of resources, and he still was probably less useful than 369 throughout this game. It's just not a great look for Team Liquid. Overall, they just felt completely outclassed outclassed in this series. And the reason I'm not like talking about this is because this was entirely expected. I think there is a gigantic gap between the second and the third best teams at this tournament, and I think this really did kind of reinforce that for me. Team Liquid has a very good shot to be the third best team at this tournament. Top Esports has a really good shot to be the second best team at this tournament. I think there's a real shot that we see this matchup again in the semifinals, in the first round of the best of 5 stage. And if that ends up happening, unfortunately for Team Liquid, I just don't know if they're going to be able to come out on top. But it's a really nice win for Top Esports. Kanavi looked excellent. 369 looked excellent. Crisp looked excellent. It's the players you needed to see step up, the players who did kind of struggle on day number 1 that really bounced back here. I still believe this team is significantly better than anyone not named Hanwha Life at this tournament. And honestly, given time, like we've seen this team get better over the course of this year, who's to say they're not going to level up throughout this tournament and be able to compete with HLE by the end? Obviously, day number 1 wasn't exactly the most encouraging sign in the world, but this is still a very talented team that can do absolutely ridiculous things with any sort of pressure. Alright, but that is going to do it for my first stand, day number 2 overview and analysis video. Up on the screen, the updated standings after 2 days of action. The only undefeated teams left have both only played 1 series. HLE, of course, winning on day 1. The Flying Oysters here winning on day number 2. They are both sitting undefeated, not only at 1-0, but at 2-0 in terms of game score. Really excited to see what the Oysters end up doing here, what CFO ends up being. I think their future matchups are going to be really intriguing to watch. I don't think they're on the level of like an HLE or a Top Esports, but they absolutely could beat a Team Liquid. I think that that's a pretty reasonable thing to expect, especially after what we saw out of TL today. But as we kind of reinforced, Corp is in a pretty dire situation. They now have to pull off an upset against either Top Esports or Hanwha Life in order to have any chance of staying alive. Every other team has at least 1 series win at this point. If Corp can't beat one of the 2 tournament favorites, they're 0-4. They're done. It does not matter how many games they win. They could, lose 2-1 in both of those series and they're guaranteed out. And so, it's do or die for Corp, which is certainly not ideal, but these are the standings. Let me know what you guys think of not only the games today, but all of the future upcoming games, who you think's going to do well at the rest of this tournament, how you think the standings are going to shape out, and how you think the bracket stage might go. Let me know all of that down in the comments section below. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We're going to be posting about every single day of First Stand on this channel, day 3, day 4, all the best of 5 stuff, everything. So if you're interested in that, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all